Right. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, my audio cut out. This is Jaleesa Tate, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at MEMA. We are going to go ahead and get started today. We are recording this session just so everyone knows, and during the entire time of recording, the recording symbol will also be present in the upper left-hand side of the screen as well, too. So first off, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are very excited about BRIC. We've been getting a lot of questions about BRIC as well too, so we know people throughout the state are also excited, and we're just happy to see everyone interested in furthering the state's risk reduction and mitigation efforts. So before we get too far into today, I do want to kind of lay the foundation for what we want to achieve with today's meeting. So BRIC is an entirely new program. There is a lot of information coming out that is available and very rapidly from FEMA as well too. So today we definitely want to try and start building that foundation throughout the state for the program, but please do not take this as a exhaustive presentation of all the details of the program. At the end of the presentation, we will list out a variety of resources if there is a particular part of the program you'd like to gain additional information in regards to. And in addition to that, MEMA will continue to host these informational sessions and provide technical assistance throughout the program, and as we start looking towards preparing for next year as well too. Right, so BRIC is replacing the pre-disaster mitigation program. So FEMA has 3 hazard mitigation assistance programs. The hazard mitigation grant program is actually funding available once a presidential disaster declaration has been approved. There is the flood mitigation assistance program, which is also an annual program like BRIC, and we will detail that today as well too. And then the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program is the newest annual program that will replace the previous pre-disaster mitigation assistance program. Okay, so today we will go over the Maryland specific timeline. We will talk about subapplicant eligibility and what it means to be a subapplicant. We'll go over the flood mitigation assistance program and then building resilient infrastructure and communities programs, provide next steps for Maryland subapplicants, and then open up the floor for questions as well too. I certainly encourage you that if throughout the presentation today you have questions, feel free to input those into the chat. We are going to try to automatically mute everyone just to try and have a smooth virtual meeting. To unmute yourself, you will enter *6 should you want to verbally state your question. But again, if you are able to, please input those questions into the chat and we will answer them. But we can certainly open up at the end of today's meeting to have verbal questions as well too. All right, so in regards to the timeline, so FEMA, they have been doing a very great job of also doing a lot of informational sessions and outreach. So they are hosting these Notice of Funding Opportunity webinars. So the NOFO essentially sets up the criteria for that year's grant program. So in today's MEMA presentation, you might see some items that are borrowed from those presentations and a lot of the same information. And again, our goal today is to reiterate all of this information, but providing the Maryland perspective for you. In Maryland, we ask sub-applicants to submit what we call a notice of interest. So it's a one-page form to provide us an overview of the proposal that you would like to submit for the grant program. Those are going to be due August 31st. They are available on our website. And we can get those to you too. And then later in the presentation, we'll go over those again. FEMA will also host some application pitfall webinars. So essentially, it's kind of like a best practice for developing your applications. So those are repeat sessions. So you can either participate on September 1 or September 2nd. MEMA will notify our sub-applicants to proceed with developing their sub-applications on September 8th. So once we've had an opportunity to review your notice of interest, ensure that your proposal is applicable to either program, then we will provide feedback and you can begin developing your sub-application. In October, MEMA will also host a application development technical assistance webinar. So that way we give people time to start really getting the materials together for their application, and then providing the technical assistance throughout that process as well too. Sub-applications will be due to MEMA November 20th. And then I just want to make it very clear that when you are reading FEMA material and it states that the application deadline is January 29th, 2021, that's the actual date that the states have to submit our complete applications to FEMA. So if we're like in a position where we are waiting on something from one sub-applicant, but we missed that deadline, that means we missed the opportunity for everybody else in the state to apply for funding. So we will not be missing that deadline. So Maryland, we definitely have to have all of our materials together prior to January 29th. So for your purposes as the sub-applicant, your applications are due November 20th. And then for MEMA's person interest, our applications are due to FEMA January 29th. All right, and so with that, Kristen Forty, the lead hazard mitigation specialist at MEMA, will speak to you all about sub-applicant eligibility.
Good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Jaleesa. So to start off with, individuals, businesses, and nonprofits are unable to apply directly for these grant programs and must be sponsored by their local government or state agency, which are considered sub-applicants. So keep in mind that this is an excellent time to build existing partnerships or new partnerships. So the sub-applicant applies through the applicant, which is MEMA, and then we send one compiled group of projects to FEMA for review. Next slide, please. So in order to be eligible to apply, sub-applicants must have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan by the application deadline, the state application deadline, so January 29th, and at the time that funding is obligated. Here you can see on the right-hand side shows a map of each county and where they are in the terms for their timeline of their hazard mitigation plan status. A BCA must also be provided or other documentation that's approved by FEMA that validates not only cost effectiveness, but technical feasibility for the project as well. We will also be discussing through the presentation some requirements for both FMA and BRIC, but note that additional information can be found within the respective Notice of Funding Opportunity documents. Next slide, thank you. An eligible cost that directly relates to developing a sub-application is pre-award costs. So example of pre-award costs are on the right. So compiling NEPA data, developing a benefit cost analysis, preparing design specifications, conducting workshops or meetings to develop sub-application are a few examples. So these costs have the opportunity to be 100% federally funded, or you can contribute to a cost share. And they must be identified as a line item in your sub-application, and they can only be incurred prior to the date of the award of the project. So that it does not, these pre-award costs do not cover activities such as starting construction or completing a component of the project prior to the award, because generally that's not eligible anyway. But if an award is not approved, then please note that you can't get reimbursed for those pre-award costs. For management costs, so management costs allow FEMA to provide financial assistance to reimburse any sub-applicants who are for eligible and reasonable indirect costs and direct administrative costs or other administrative expenses associated with a specific mitigation project. So examples can include sub-application development, completing the BCA, and technical monitoring. And some examples of indirect costs can include general administration and expenses, personnel and accounting, etc. So for management costs, no more than 5% can be requested in the budget. So for example, if your total project cost equals $100,000, the max you can request for management costs would be $5,000. And once again, just like pre-award costs, FEMA will provide 100% of federal funding for those management costs, so there's no cost share for this. So I'll also be going over the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program and discussing its funding availability and eligible activities. So FMA is available to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings and structures that are insured under the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. So the FMA program prioritizes repetitive and severe repetitive loss properties, which we'll go into those definitions a little later on. It also prioritizes properties that are insured under the NFIP. So also funding is solely available for flood risk projects and plans. To expand upon the program a little bit, the funds are made available on an annual basis, so you can apply to this program every year. It's also nationally competitive, so you'll be competing for funding with other sub-applications from all across the country. And like previously mentioned, it's limited to flood mitigation activities only. A community must be in good standing with the NFIP, and when we say good standing, that means a community must not be withdrawn, on probation, or suspended. So if you're unsure if a community is participating, you can Google FEMA's community status book, and that shows status updates, whether a community participates, doesn't participate, or is suspended or sanctioned. And also, a mitigated property must carry NFIP policy before, during, and in perpetuity of the project. So the notice of funding opportunity was released, and FEMA announced that it will distribute the available funding amounts as follows. So these 5 categories. First, we have project scoping. So there's $4 million available total for this category. Maryland is capped, so every state is capped at only being able to submit a total project where the total federal share is $600,000 or below. The second category is the community flood mitigation, where $70 million has been set aside. There is a max federal share cap for each sub-application of $30 million in the federal share. And then there is a remaining $86 million made available to the next 3 categories. The technical assistance category, according to the specifications that FEMA has provided, Maryland is unable to apply for that. We have the flood hazard mitigation planning category. So Maryland is capped at submitting a $100,000 federal share for this category. And each planning sub-application has a max of $25,000 for the federal share to be submitted. And then the individual flood mitigation projects, there are no caps associated with this category. And just as a reminder, on the bottom, a max of 5% of the total sub-application can be submitted for those management costs. As a quick refresher, so these are some eligible activities. This list is not exhaustive, so if there is another project that you're interested in possibly pursuing, you can contact us and we can individually discuss the project. But some examples that we commonly see are acquisition, demolitions, elevation, retrofitting, soil stabilization, etc. So when it comes to the cost share, federal funding is available for up to 75% of eligible activity costs. However, FEMA may contribute the following federal share for properties that are insured under the NFIP at the time of application, and if they meet the following repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss definitions. These are also defined in the NOFO if you need a little bit more detail. So for the repetitive loss, 90% federal costs can be contributed. That's the middle blue bar. So in order to meet the repetitive loss definition, the property has to have flood damage on 2 occasions where the cost of repair has equaled or exceeded 25% of the value of the structure when flooded. And then for a property to meet the severe repetitive loss, that's the first category and the third category on the right-hand side. So the property has to have incurred flood-related damage of at least 4 claims of $5,000 or more, equaling or exceeding $20,000, or 2 or more claims that have exceeded the market value of the insured structure. So I just would like to note too, although some areas and jurisdictions have their own definitions for repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, we must go off of the code, the U.S. code definitions in order to have a reduced or an increased federal cost share. So the first category, this is project scoping. So this was formerly called advanced assistance. And this is seed money for analysis and design for future community mitigation and individual property mitigation projects. So projects will be scored and selected by FEMA based on the following priorities. So the first one would be if the community is participating in the CRS and what their class is. if a community participates in the cooperating technical partners, how the cost share is being taken on, if there are any NFIP policies in claims, and then if there are any repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties within that specified project area. For community flood mitigation projects, so these projects are available to address flood risk to the NFIP within a specific drainage area. So some project examples include the localized flood control, floodwater storage and diversion, floodplain and stream restoration, stormwater management, and then wetland restoration and creation. So a geo-enabled project benefiting area map is required by FEMA, and FEMA does have a job aid to go a little bit more in depth on their website to explain different types of file types and software that can be used and how to create and prepare this required element for the sub-application. And on the right-hand side, you can kind of see a step-by-step process of what FEMA is interested in. And then also, like the previous category, there are some prioritization factors, CRS, CTP, the cost share, NFIP, and the severe repetitive and repetitive loss. So we're skipping category 3 because Maryland is unable to apply to that category. So the next category would be the flood mitigation planning. So this category is for planning sub-applications for the flood component of hazard mitigation plans or updates to certain plans. So just to note, a hazard mitigation plan cannot be fully funded in this category, but the flood sections within a hazard mitigation plan can be used. And then the 5th category would be the individual flood mitigation projects. So these are the typical projects we usually see when it comes to elevations, acquisition, demolitions, relocations, reconstruction. Once again, this list is not exhaustive. Here are some visual representations of eligible activities that have been constructed. So on the left-hand side, we see dry floodproofing. So that keeps the building dry by sealing the structure to keep any floodwaters out. You can do this for non-residential structures and historical residential structures. The middle picture shows the localized flood risk reduction. This is for a culvert improvement specifically. But this overall activity just tries to lessen the frequency or severity of flooding to a specific area. So other project examples include retention, detention basins, etc. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have the miscellaneous category, and this picture just represents a flood warning sign for the community.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So now we will start jumping into the BRIC program. So the name of the program is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. It's nice because FEMA has defined some guiding principles that kind of sets the tone for the program. So they are focused heavily on capability and capacity building, innovation, partnerships, large infrastructure projects, ensuring that the program has flexibility and providing consistency as well too. And essentially these guiding principles do kind of boil back from some stakeholder feedback that they received to really shape the program as it was being developed. So similar to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, these funds are also available annually. The program is nationally competitive. One of the big things that separates this program from the previous pre-disaster mitigation program is that after 180 days after each presidential disaster declaration, 6% of the estimated expenses that are spent in categories such as public assistance, individual assistance, will go into a pot, and that pot will be dedicated to funding the BRIC program. So previously for the pre-disaster mitigation program, those funds were established through a congressional appropriation each year. And so based on that, FEMA estimates the annual funds will average between $300 to $500 million per year. And so again, comparing this and trying to differentiate BRIC from PDM, historically, a lot of the years of PDM funding hover around 25 million. In the last 2 years, that amount increased to 250 million. And for this first year of BRIC, there will be $500 million available nationwide for the states to apply for. So further going into how BRIC differs from PDM, so it sets clear priorities, and those priorities are to focus on mitigating community lifelines, focusing on infrastructure projects. Building codes are a new priority under BRIC, promoting partnerships, and then really encouraging innovative projects. There's also a new focus on building capacity. So there's a funding category specifically for capability and capacity building. FEMA has also created another category to provide non-financial technical assistance to communities that are trying to really evaluate their resilience and how to continuously build their resilience. And finally, they have actually created a mitigation action portfolio, which provides a selection of case studies from across the United States and across a variety of different hazards as well too. And in addition to that, it actually has a matrix that connects the mitigation activity to the lifeline that it will also mitigate. And it increases flexibility. So there is a reduction in the limitations on the program. The funding caps for each category have increased as well too. And then as Kristen spoke about earlier, there's this new allowance for pre-award costs. And so generally pre-award costs were permitted previously, but they were not, they had to be tied to the application start date, which only provided a few months. But now we can go back further. So if you were starting to develop your application now, you could start tracking those costs and include those in your application as pre-award costs. And then finally, BRIC sets to streamline the process. So a few of you may have seen that FEMA has started messaging about their new grant portal, which is called FEMA Go. We'll talk briefly about that at the end of the meeting today as well too. They are providing greater flexibility for project extensions. So previously for PDM, the standard period of performance that you had to implement a project was 36 months. Instead of that, now FEMA is permitting you to go ahead and set a different performance period when you initially apply if you have the justification to show that it will take longer than those 36 months. And then the last thing is that they are more open to phase projects now as well too. So as far as the available funding and the categories, so like I said, there is $500 million available total across the entire BRIC program. There is a state allocation. And so essentially when we say state allocation, what that means is that each state or tribe will have $600,000 set aside that essentially if we submit that amount of eligible activities, then we receive those funds. And then the rest of the funding is strictly competitive. However, within that $600,000, that is where all of the capacity and capability activities have to be put. It's also where all of our mitigation planning activities also have to be put. And for planning and planning related activities, each state is permitted a maximum request of $300,000. And then within that category, up to 10% of it can be used for information dissemination. For the next category of funding is in our more traditional mitigation projects. So think in terms of more construction type projects, so shovel and ground. So there's $446.4 million available in that category. As a sub-applicant, you can submit a max $50 million application. So again, think of those larger infrastructure projects. Also within this category, up to 10% of the funding can be used for information dissemination. And then for the last category is the non-financial direct technical assistance. This year, kind of the cap, if you will, is that FEMA, they only intend to select up to 10 communities nationwide. And we will get more into what it looks like for a community to request that assistance. And I see a question here. We do not have a limit on the applications. Thank you, Kristen. Right. So in terms of eligible activities, all the activities that were previously eligible under the pre-disaster mitigation program, they are still eligible. BRIC actually expands upon the eligible activities. So now, similar to some of the things we said earlier, project scoping is eligible, building code activities, additional activities for wildfire and wind mitigation, and then earthquake early warning systems as well too. The things to keep in mind are that projects still have to remain cost effective. So yes, the traditional FEMA benefit cost analysis is still required for projects. The intent of the project still has to be reducing or eliminating risk from a natural hazard. So it can certainly have other co-benefits, but at the forefront, it needs to be focused on reducing or mitigating natural hazards. Projects who have to have adopted the latest 2 consensus codes, so building codes. It has to align with the hazard mitigation plan, so that means the local plan and the state plan as well too. And then, of course, you have to meet all the environmental and historic preservation requirements. And so in order to meet those requirements, you'll figure more of that out. We'll go through that as we develop the applications. And a lot of that is determined on like when the structures were built, the location of things. So it's really on a project by project basis for what type of information would be required for that. Right. So the cost share for this, the standard cost share across all of FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance programs is a maximum 75% federal share and a minimum 25% non-federal share. For the BRIC program, FEMA does permit an increased cost share for what they consider small and impoverished communities. So that increased cost share would be a maximum 90% federal cost share and a 10% minimum non-federal cost share. And so they define a small impoverished community as an area with 3,000 or fewer individuals that is identified by the state as disadvantaged, and where the per capita annual income does not exceed 80% of the national per capita income. So this is different from the definition previously. Previously under PDM, the definition also included a metric for the local versus national unemployment rates as well too. So that has been removed. Okay, so kind of going through the categories now. In terms of the first category that permits the state allocation and the capacity and capability building activities. So there's a variety of things that you can apply for under here. So it ranges from the building codes, partnerships, project scoping, and then planning as well too. And so it's really meant to increase the ability of a community to identify and then plan to pursue projects to mitigate the risk posed from natural hazards. And also any capability and capacity building activities, they have to result in a tangible resource, strategy, or product. So if you are looking at building partnerships or different things like that, then there needs to be an actual product at the end that kind of shows that strategy. Right. So then in terms of building codes, and I will also mention that for each one of these categories within the capacity and capability section, more detailed fact sheet. So also included in here is the link to those as well too. So for building code activities, this is meant to assist with the facilitation to adopt and implement the codes. And so again, it would be codes really focused on ensuring that we are reducing the risk to natural hazards. You can use the funding to enhance your existing codes or requirements. So let's say if you were interested in enhancing your current floodplain code in order to, apply to participate in the CRS program or increase your CRS class, this is definitely an activity where you could pursue a proposal under. And then also this is meant to develop the professional workforce capabilities through technical assistance and training. So if you kind of feel like, you are not the subject matter expert and you would like to increase your community's ability by developing the workforce, that is an activity that you could apply for as well. Okay. So then partnership activities. So for this one, this is meant to basically fund a variety of activities. So it can range from doing a gap analysis to kind of identify who are the partners who have something and who are the partners that need that something. Also to attend partnerships and trainings to, again, increase your capabilities, figuring out how to incorporate the private sector and the lifeline operators. So we know that a large majority of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So you can pursue funding to develop some type of strategy to seek out the private sector and build those partnerships. You can develop a partner database. Host a forum to share best practices and lessons learned. Obviously, with today's environment, that would probably look like a virtual setting. So looking at, whatever things you need for the virtual setting, whether it's the hosting platform or, a facilitator for the meeting, and then also attending conferences to support partnership development as well, too. Okay. So in terms of project scoping, Kristen covered this a little bit earlier because project scoping is also available under the flood mitigation assistance programs. So again, it supports what we say is seed money to develop an application for a future project. So this can include doing the engineering, design and feasibility studies, conducting H&H studies. So you can kind of identify why areas are flooding and what needs to be done to correct those. So kind of like project identification too. Developing a cost share strategy. So if you have, a project in which you don't have the cost share, just, your community, this is where that partnership building comes into play as well too. EHP compliance. So again, project by project, but if you need to do any type of studies, archaeological studies, anything like that, you can utilize the project scoping to go ahead and do those and fund that. And then development of the benefit cost analysis as well. Okay, so in terms of planning, mitigation planning really is an opportunity for us to look at all of our communities and assess what mitigation and risk reduction capabilities we have in place and identify those gaps. It's also an opportunity really to identify the hazards, identify the risk, and then kind of hash out a plan for how we intend to approach that. So hazard mitigation planning is composed of a hazard identification and risk assessment, or a HIRA, vulnerability and capability assessment, and then development of the mitigation strategy as well. Okay, so then the second category, again, is focused on mitigation projects. So what you would commonly think of as like your more traditional mitigation projects. So very similar to what is eligible under the flood mitigation assistance program, but this does not have to strictly be tied to mitigating a flood hazard. It can mitigate other hazards as well too. So acquisition demolition projects, elevations, mitigation reconstruction, dry flood proofing, generators, safe room construction, wind retrofits, and there are several more activities that would be eligible as well too. And again, just to reiterate that projects have to be cost effective, so they do need to have a good benefit cost ratio that's determined through FEMA's benefit cost analysis. It needs to focus on mitigating natural hazards, although we do strongly encourage co-benefits as well too. You have to meet the latest 2 consensus codes. It needs to align with your local and state hazard mitigation plan, and then it also needs to meet all those EHP requirements. So in terms of the non-financial direct technical assistance, if a community is interested in applying for this, I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and reach out directly to us so we can start determining, how to put together a letter. There's no application required for this. You only submit a letter of interest to FEMA. Like I said, FEMA only intends to select up to 10 local governments or communities throughout the entire country to receive this direct technical assistance. When you're requesting assistance, it has to result in improvement of your community's capacity and capability, increase in the community's resilience, and then identifying projects that would contribute to increasing the resilience. FEMA is going to prioritize on communities that have not received any FEMA hazard mitigation fund in the past few years. Communities that fall within that small and impoverished category, and communities that actually demonstrate a need to require technical assistance. Okay. So those are the categories, and stuff is discussed mitigation and review. So if you feel give me 1 second. I'm okay. Is this better, everyone? Can you hear me now? Yes, yes. Okay, perfect. All right. So in terms of the mitigation action portfolio, I've been looking through this, and honestly, it's quite an impressive document, and I strongly encourage everyone to check it out. Even if you aren't thinking about pursuing BRIC or FMA funding this year, I honestly just really think it's a very good document to start seeing how people in different geographies are pursuing mitigation, how they are mitigating different community lifelines and approaching a variety of hazards too. So again, it's case studies from throughout the entire country. It is organized by hazard. So obviously in Maryland, flooding is a big one for us, but that doesn't mean that we're not impacted by other hazards. So you can kind of see how people approach those different hazards too. It does align each project with the community lifelines. And I like this because personally, I kind of feel like sometimes I go to conferences and people talk about all the successes of the projects, but they don't really tell you how much it costs, how they gathered all the funding to fund it, and then who the partners were and what the timeline was. And so for this, they provide the scope for the project, the cost, how funding was obtained to carry out the activity, who the partners were, what the timeline looks like, and so forth. And it won't be a stagnant document, so FEMA does intend to update it periodically. So if you are on this call today and you keep hearing us talking about large infrastructure projects or how FEMA is prioritizing innovation under the program as well too, definitely encourage you to kind of go through the action portfolio to just get inspiration about different things that you can do in the arena of mitigation. All right, so last up is this is kind of new. Previously under PDM, we weren't really aware too much of how FEMA was scoring and ranking projects. So now that information is easily available, I'll say. So the first part is that FEMA will perform a technical review and they will assign points based on these 8 categories here. And so it's just going to be either yes, you fall into this category, or no, you don't. So yes, you either get the points or no, you won't. So they'll be looking to see if it's an infrastructure project. So again, it is a building resilient infrastructure and communities program, so it is focused on infrastructure. They will look at if you are actually mitigating a lifeline, so you can mitigate one lifeline or you can mitigate multiple lifelines. Incorporation of nature-based solutions. So this is one that we're really excited about because previously it was challenging to try and have nature-based projects, but now it is a priority under the program. Looking at if you have adopted the appropriate building codes, looking at what your BSEGS rating is, and there are resources for you to determine that, or of course, check in with your building code enforcement office as well too. They will look at, is this a project that has been generated from a previous HMA Advanced Assistance Award? So in Maryland right now, we have 2 communities that actually have advanced assistance projects that have been awarded. And so we'll be working with them because, you know, you get additional points. And so it says advanced assistance, and then moving forward after this first year of BRIC, that will change to project scoping. Are you able to provide an increased non-federal cost share? So the minimum across most of the grants is going to be 25%, but you can get additional points if you can go higher than that 25%. And again, that's where the partnership building comes into play as well too. And then the last one is going to be, are you designated as a small impoverished community? So we have some planning data that we can send out to kind of show you where those small impoverished communities are located. We will have to, you know, just go back because the criteria has changed slightly. All right, so a little bit about community lifelines. So when we are talking about community lifelines, those were initially developed through FEMA to really help with response efforts. So there are 7 community lifelines, and they range from things like food, water, and shelter, hazardous materials, communications, energy, and so on. And so when you think about community lifelines, you really want to think in terms of, if a community is in the middle of an emergency, what are the services that are critical to the community still being able to function? And so kind of tying that to mitigation, you know, we're also prioritizing community lifelines because when we're looking at recovery and we want to try and shorten that recovery period and get people back into their homes or their businesses, you know, quickly after a disaster, we really need to make sure that we are mitigating and reducing potential impacts to those community lifelines as well, too. All right, so then the second thing that they will do after their technical review is they will do a qualitative review as well too. So then these points are assigned more on a sliding scale. So it will look at how are you approaching your risk reduction and resiliency? How are you including future conditions? So it's not just about climate change and sea level rise, but also changes to your land use, your population, different things like that. So those are good opportunities for plan integration. So looking at your community's comprehensive plan, maybe the green infrastructure plan as well if you have one. So then the third category is your implementation measures. So basically, does your application clearly lay out how you intend to implement this activity? Do you have success metrics that you want to include? Do you have all the responsible agencies identified and their task identified within the plan? Is your schedule reasonable as well too? Then it will look at the population that's being impacted. So it's going to look at, you know, what size of population will this benefit? So a big push from MEMA in recent years has been to ensure that we are pursuing community-based projects, so we are able to provide a risk reduction to a larger portion of the population. They also want to know, when we're looking at socially vulnerable populations, how does your project benefit those populations too? Looking at the outreach activities, so what outreach activities are you doing? How has the mitigation planning process contributed to the activities that you are now proposing? And then the last category is leveraging those partners. So what type of partners are involved in your project? How are they contributing to the project and different things like that? And so if you have participated, you know, with us in any of the previous 2 years for the hazard mitigation assistance programs, you will recognize that a lot of this criteria does already align with MEMA's criteria that we also use to review and rank our projects. So we've kind of been working at it for a few years just to make sure, number one, that we are approaching risk reduction and building our state's resiliency. But I don't want anybody to feel overwhelmed that there are all these new criteria that they have to meet, because in fact, we've actually been doing it for a few years now. based on the measures that MEMA had already put in place. But again, this is really good because now we kind of get to see behind the curtain and you have more information about how your proposals will be viewed and then ranked by FEMA. And yes, a federal agency such as the USACE Baltimore District can be a partner. Okay, so best practices. So I would definitely encourage you to build upon your existing efforts. And so number one, the biggest existing effort is definitely for you to go back to your hazard mitigation, your local hazard mitigation plans, look in there, determine, don't recreate the wheel. Look at the projects and the actions that you had already identified. This is the opportunity to really go through and start implementing your mitigation strategy. So the second one is seeking out multidisciplinary solutions. So I'm really big on this because I don't think that mitigation is a one size fits all. And I think that by implementing mitigation projects, we can definitely get a lot of co-benefits out of these projects too. So whether it is increasing water quality, or if it's like the mitigation project, you know, in Frederick County with Carroll Creek, that also has a lot of different community benefits and economic benefits to it as well too. So then when it comes to building partners and different things like that, definitely look and try to identify what the commonalities are between you and your stakeholders, because then you're all working towards a common goal. If you are concerned about, you know, resources, whether it is funding or staffing, Maryland is a small state, so it's also an opportunity to explore regional opportunities as well too, because chances are if you're experiencing an impact from a certain hazard, then the adjacent counties and communities are as well. And then taking a whole community approach. So it's not just looking for partners within government, but looking non-traditionally as well too. So looking outside of government to our private sector, the nonprofit sector, academia. And in Maryland recently, I've seen a lot of just grassroots efforts that have really gone very far as just community members reaching out to other people and bringing in their own partners. And then prioritizing mitigating those community lifelines, because that is ultimately how we will build our community resilience. All right.
Great.
So go ahead, Kristen.
Sorry. So now that we have a better understanding of the FMA and BRIC program, here are some next steps. So this is the anticipated timeline that you can follow. So August 31st, 2020, that is when the notice of interest is due to our office. I will go over that on the next slide. September 2020, FEMA is having webinars for the NOFO application development and the FEMA Go webinar. So definitely be on the lookout for any emails that the mitigation branch sends out so that you can participate. September 30th, that is when on the FEMA Go system that the grant application period opens. So you won't be able to access the sub-application until that time. In November, that is when the sub-application is due to MEMA. And then once we do receive the sub-applications, we will do our internal review and our selection process, and that will be all those projects will then be submitted to FEMA on the state's deadline of January 29th. So if you aren't familiar with our notice of interest and you don't have one, this can be downloaded from the Mitigation's website. So all sub-applicants must submit a notice of interest form to for us to review and to make sure that the project is applicable under the FMA or the BRIC program. So this is a one-page form. It must be filled out completely, and you can provide additional documentation or photos if you are interested. This NOI, it really gives us an idea of the project that you want to pursue and the overall total project cost. So once it is completed, please send it to our mitigation.mema@maryland.gov email address, once again, by the 31st for review.
All right, so now some information on FEMA Go. So FEMA Go is MEMA, or I'm sorry, FEMA's new grant system that is really meant to streamline the grants process across all of FEMA's grants. So previously they had already started administering some programs through there. So I think it was the assistance to firefighter grants and maybe one or two others, but ultimately all of the public assistance grants, the mitigation grants, the response and recovery items as well too, will be put in FEMA Go. So I don't have information on when that timeline and implementation will happen, but for mitigation for this year's BRIC and FMA programs, that will happen this year. And so what the idea of it is that it's going to streamline the process and the timeliness as well too. So if you have been a previous subrecipient of the grants, this is now for these grants how you will do like your quarterly reporting and different things like that. So for FEMA Go, we will be issuing additional information when we notify you to proceed with your sub-application of how to register in the system. And so if you have any other previous accounts for FEMA grants, grant administration systems, you will still have to re-register and create a new registration for FEMA Go. And then the last thing on that is that the way we are going to do it is first we will prioritize ensuring that our sub-applicants who intend to pursue funding this year are registered. The next tier will be ensuring that all of the eligible sub-applicants, such as our local jurisdictions, and state agencies that have expressed interest for subsequent years are registered. And then the third tier for prioritization will be ensuring that everyone across the board is registered within the system. So that is the information that we have on FEMA Go. FEMA, they will be having additional webinars and training dedicated to FEMA Go. So when we receive that information, we will email it out. If you are currently not receiving information from the Hazard Mitigation Branch at MEMA, please send us the email at mitigation.mema@maryland.gov, and we can ensure that you're on that list and you can stay up to date. I do want to let everyone know, honestly, the information from FEMA is coming out very fast right now. So we are trying to make sure that we are consolidating everything and increasing communication to get that out to you. Our main form of communication is email. So we'll definitely be emailing you all a lot. So just make sure, that where part of your contacts is not going to your junk email address. And then the second thing is that we are also putting a priority and an emphasis on making sure that our website is updated so you have access to that information through that platform as well. Okay, so here are a variety of FEMA resources. FEMA has also recently updated their entire website. I find it to be more user-friendly now, so I do encourage you to kind of check out these resources. The Mitigation Action Portfolio is linked here. So is the full Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance, and then specific resources for the FMA and BRIC programs as well, too. All right, so with that, I do want to, I think I missed a few questions in the chat, so please feel free if you would like to verbally ask a question to *6 to unmute, and then other than that, I'll start working my way up to answer some of the chat questions. Okay, so I have a question here. What are MEMA's evaluation criteria priorities for the state allocation and for the national competition? Okay, so the way that this works, number one is that we do have our actual evaluation criteria is on our website, so you can always download that form to serve as a guide when you're developing your proposals and application, and we can also send it out as well too. So the first category that we at the state look at is going to be, how does your project align with the state priorities? We'll look at what hazards you are mitigating based on how hazards are identified in the state hazard mitigation plan. We will look at if you are protecting critical infrastructure and kind of what percentage of the population you are protecting. We'll look at the status of your hazard mitigation plan if you're applying for hazard mitigation planning activities. We will look at the cost effectiveness, what performance metrics you have in place, the completeness of your sub-application, the social vulnerability of the population that the project will benefit, and then we give it an overall rating about all of your risk reduction activities, and that's an opportunity for us to look at your participation in NFIP and CRS, make sure that you're using funds efficiently, and other mitigation indicators, so to speak. And then the way that we rank those is actually through a mitigation advisory committee that's composed of multiple state agencies. All right, so the DUNS number. So after this, I will send out information again regarding to FEMA Go. You don't need to request a new DUNS number for the BRIC program. Your DUNS number, SAM.gov information should always stay the same. I think for SAM.gov, you have to register every year, but your DUNS number should stay the same. All right, the next question, how do we determine which flood mitigation projects are better suited for FMA versus BRIC? So again, I would say look at the criteria for BRIC as far as their technical and qualitative ranking things. If you have a project that is in an area where it's benefiting repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties, I would definitely say FMA is probably a better fit because FMA is specifically geared towards those types of properties. And, all right, and I think if I'm missing somebody's question, please feel free to retype it in here, or again, if you have another question and you want to verbally ask that, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. All right, so when will the grant award letters be sent? 1 second to find the actual date. So in all, from the time you submit to the time of award, it takes approximately 1 year. And hold on, give me 1 second, I'll find the actual grant numbers. And so what FEMA does is after you submit, they then do a kind of preliminary notification, if you will. And during that preliminary notification is when they will either state that the project has been selected for further review, so that it will move forward, or that it did not meet the program requirements, which means that it just didn't meet one of the requirements. And generally they provide us a national technical review report that will let us know what specific requirement it did not meet. And then the last one is that the project was just not selected, which typically means that there was not enough funding available, and that is why the project did not meet those requirements. And this information can also be found in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And I am not seeing the actual date for notification in there. But generally, the notification comes out, it'll be June 2021, and then they award funds by December 2021. Let's see, there's a question, are there changes to FMA or BRIC that affect projects already in place? No. So this is only for federal fiscal year 20. So everything that's already awarded will still remain just as it is. All right, and I'll give folks a few more seconds to ask any additional questions that you might have. All right, and so seeing none, thank you all once again for tuning in today. We greatly appreciate it. Um, like I said, information honestly is coming out very quickly at FEMA from FEMA, so we will be doing our best to make sure that all of that is communicated to everyone. Again, if you are not currently receiving mitigation updates from us, please email us at mitigation.mema@maryland.gov. We will also update our website to, like I said, try and include this recording if that is possible. Link to the BRIC and FMA pages in the Notice of Funding Opportunities, and then we will send this information out to people who joined us today as well too. And so with that, thank you everyone and have a good week.